The 15th of March 1963, Chelyabinsk City Archive. Case of a missing person. In the police archives of the industrial city of Chelyabinsk lies case number 247, a thin folder with faded ink. Inside is a statement about the disappearance of 25-year-old Dasha Ivanova, who vanished that spring after a visit to the House of Culture. The investigation lasted 3 months, then was suspended due to lack of leads. An ordinary story for the post-war years. People disappeared. Some left for work and never returned. Some started a new life in another city. Some simply dissolved into thin air. The case was closed and forgotten, but one woman did not forget. For 7 years, Olga Petrova came to the police every month, asked about her sister, showed a photograph, begged them to continue the search. She was told the same thing over and over. No leads, no witnesses, no traces. Perhaps her sister left on her own. Perhaps she started a new life somewhere far away. Perhaps she simply doesn't want to be found. Olga didn't believe it. She knew her sister too well. They had grown up together after their mother's death and their father's death on the front. Olga had raised Dasha like her own daughter, though she herself was only 7 years older. They were more than sisters. They were all each other had left in this world. Weeks turned into months. Olga scoured the entire city and its surroundings, pasting announcements with Dasha's photo on poles and in buses, questioning people at the House of Culture. Alexei supported her as best he could, driving her to hospitals and morgues, talking to his acquaintances in various institutions, trying to reach the police leadership through them. He was attentive and patient. He never said what others said. Maybe it's time to accept it. Maybe she really did leave. Alexei believed along with Olga, and that faith was her only support. A year passed. The searches yielded nothing. The case of Dasha's disappearance gradually got lost among hundreds of other unsolved ones. The local officer increasingly rarely answered when Olga called. Acquaintances began avoiding conversations about the missing girl. Life went on. People had their own worries, their own problems. Only Olga couldn't let go. At night, she lay sleepless, imagining hundreds of scenarios in her mind. Maybe Dasha was lying unconscious in some hospital. Maybe she had lost her memory. And maybe, and this thought was worse than all the others, she was no longer alive. Alexei never complained about her obsession with the searches. When Olga set off again on a new lead, no matter how faint, he calmly said, "Go. I understand everything. I'll wait." When she sobbed at night, he stroked her hair and was silent, because there were simply no words of comfort. He was the ideal husband. And Olga often thought how lucky she was to meet such a man. Without him, she would have gone mad long ago. Years passed. 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. Olga matured. New wrinkles appeared on her face, and a special sadness settled in her eyes, the kind that only comes to those who have lost hope but haven't stopped searching. She still went to the police once a month, still questioned random passers-by, still peered into the faces of women on the streets, hoping to see familiar features. But with each year, hope grew less, and the dull pain of loss grew stronger. And then one day, on an ordinary rainy evening, Olga returned home earlier than usual. Alexei was delayed at the factory. They had an urgent order, and the foreman had to work late. The apartment greeted her with silence and semi-darkness. Olga took off her wet coat, put the kettle on the stove, and suddenly felt a strange unease. Something was wrong. She couldn't understand what exactly, but inside, everything tightened from an inexplicable anxiety. She went into the bedroom, turned on the light. Everything was in its place. The bed neatly made, the chest of drawers with framed photos, the wicker cabinet against the wall. Olga approached the cabinet, wanted to take out a warm sweater, and suddenly noticed that one of the floorboards under the cabinet was slightly raised. This was strange. Alexei always kept order, and such a trifle couldn't escape his attention. Yielding to a sudden impulse, Olga pushed the cabinet aside. Beneath it was a loosely fitting board. Her heart beat faster. Her fingers trembled as she pried the board up. Under the floor was a small niche, and in it, a worn leather album. Olga took out the album and sat on the edge of the bed. The cover was scratched and worn from time. She slowly opened it. On the first page was a photograph of an unfamiliar woman, a brunette in her 30s, in a light dress and with frightened eyes. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, was written the name Natalia. The next page, another woman, red-haired, also with a strange tense expression on her face. Name, Irina. Third, fourth, fifth pages. All unfamiliar, all with the same anxious expression, as if they had been photographed against their will. And then, the seventh page. Olga grew cold. In the photo was Dasha, her younger sister, missing for 7 years. Dasha in that very blue dress in which she had left home for the last time. But this was not the Dasha that Olga remembered. Her face was gaunt, her eyes full of horror, her hair disheveled, and most terrifying of all, behind her loomed a concrete wall with peeling paint, a completely unfamiliar place. Olga's hands shook so badly that the album almost fell from her hands. She flipped further. More women, more names. A total of 12 photographs. 12 women with frightened faces against the same concrete walls. The world around her swam. A single thought pulsed in her head. This album is hidden in our house. In the house where Alexei, my husband, lives. But what does this mean? Where did he get these photos? Why is Dasha among them? Olga frantically tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe he found this album somewhere. Maybe he was conducting his own investigation and didn't tell her so as not to give false hopes. She looked at her sister's photo again, peering into every detail, and then noticed what she hadn't seen at first glance. In the background, in the corner of the frame, a shadow was faintly discernible, a male figure. On the wall behind Dasha hung some kind of tool. At that moment, Olga heard the sound of a key in the front door. Alexei had returned home. Olga slammed the album shut as if it had burned her fingers. Her heart pounded in her throat. Thoughts raced chaotically. What to do? Hide the album back? But there was no time. Alexei was already taking off his boots in the hallway. He'd walk into the room any second. Shoving it under the pillow was too obvious. An instinct for self-preservation, whose existence she hadn't even suspected, made her do the only possible thing. Olga shoved the album behind her back, under the edge of the blanket, and quickly straightened her hair, trying to give her face a normal expression. "Olenka, are you home?" Alexei's voice was so familiar, so homely. Before, this voice had soothed her, but now, a chill ran down her skin from it. "Yes, I'm here." She was surprised that her voice sounded almost normal, though inside, everything was tearing apart. In the bedroom, Alexei appeared in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, in his work jacket that smelled of machine oil and metal. An ordinary, tired man. After a hard day, he smiled that very disarming smile that always made his face kind. Early today, something happened? Olga looked at him, at this man with whom she had lived for 8 years, at these features familiar down to the last wrinkle, at the hands that had hugged her at night when she cried about her missing sister, and the thought flashed through her mind, "I don't know you. I don't know at all who you really are." My head started hurting. She lied. "I left work early." Alexei approached, sat down next to her, on the edge of the bed, so close that Olga smelled his cologne. Before, this smell meant home, safety. Now it made her nauseous. "Maybe take a pill? We should have some in the medicine cabinet." He reached out to stroke her head, but Olga instinctively pulled away, covering the movement by rubbing her temple. "I already took one." "I'll lie down a bit. It'll pass." Alexei looked at her closely, too closely. Something elusive flashed in his eyes, but Olga caught that look. Wariness, suspicion, or was it her imagination? Then rest. "I'll manage on the kitchen. Heat up dinner." He got up and left the room. Olga exhaled only when she heard him bustling in the kitchen. With trembling hands, she pulled the album from under the blanket and quickly shoved it under the mattress. The first place that came to mind, Then she stood up, approached the mirror, pale face, dilated pupils, sweat on her forehead. She needed to pull herself together. She needed to act natural, otherwise he'd suspect something. But what exactly should he suspect? That Olga had found his cash? And if it really was his cash, then why were there photos of Dasha and all these other women? Dinner passed in tense silence, which Alexei, fortunately, attributed to the headache. Olga mechanically chewed potatoes with cutlets, not tasting them. Alexei told something about the factory, about a new order, about how the foreman got drunk again and caused a scandal. An ordinary story from the ordinary life of an ordinary Soviet worker. Only now every word of his seemed false to Olga, feigned, like a poorly learned role. The night was a nightmare. Olga lay pretending to be asleep and felt the man breathing next to her under the same blanket, a man about whom she might know nothing. Alexei slept peacefully, even snoring faintly, while Olga couldn't close her eyes. The same questions swirled in her head. What do these photos mean? Is Dasha alive? Where is she? And the most terrible question, from which she wanted to scream, was the man sleeping half a meter away from her involved in her disappearance? No, it's impossible. Alexei couldn't. He had helped search for Dasha. He drove around the city with Olga, pasted announcements, talked to the police. What sense would a criminal have in participating in the investigation himself? But on the other hand, in the detective stories she sometimes read, that's exactly how criminals acted. They helped with the investigation to deflect suspicion and control the situation. By morning, when gray dawn crept into the window, Olga made a decision. She couldn't just go to the police with some found album. They'd think she was crazy. For 7 years of searching, she was already considered obsessed, or even nuts. She needed proof. She needed to understand what was really happening. And for that, she'd have to do something she never thought possible. Start spying on her own husband. Alexei left for work at the usual time, kissed Olga goodbye. This kiss seemed disgusting to her, but she forced herself to smile. As soon as the door closed behind him, she took out the album and began carefully studying every photo, every detail. The women in the shots were of different ages, from about 20 to 40, all of Slavic appearance, all in everyday clothes, and all had the same background, bare concrete walls, with pipes visible here and there, like water or heating pipes. Judging by everything, it was some kind of industrial premises, a basement, a warehouse, an abandoned building. Olga took a magnifying glass. It had been preserved from her father, who collected stamps. She began examining the details. In one of the photos, in the corner, part of some metal structure with a number was visible. The digits were blurry, but it seemed like 419 could be made out. In another shot, behind the woman hung a faded plaque with an inscription, but only the first letters could be read. Warehouse. So it was a warehouse or storage room. But in the city there were dozens, if not hundreds, of such places. Abandoned post-war buildings, old factory buildings, hangars. Olga remembered. About 6 months ago, Alexei mentioned that the factory was writing off old equipment and freeing up several storage hangars on the outskirts beyond the railway branch. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Just casual dinner talk. But now, what if? She quickly got dressed, took the album. Leaving it at home was dangerous. What if Alexei returned unexpectedly and headed to the city library? Old city plans and industrial zone diagrams were stored there. The librarian, an elderly woman in thick glasses, was surprised by the unusual request, but brought the necessary folders. Olga bent over the yellowed maps. Here's the machine building plant where Alexei works. Here's the railway branch. And here, beyond the tracks, 3 buildings are marked. Hangars number 1, number 2, number 3. Year built, 1940. Purpose, temporary storage. Her heart beat faster. It's there. She almost felt it. Dasha is there, somewhere in one of those hangars. But how to get there? How to check without putting herself in danger? If Alexei is really involved in the disappearance of women, if he's holding them there, he's dangerous. mortally dangerous. Olga remembered his strong hands, his height, his physical strength. In open confrontation, she had no chance. She needed a plan, a careful, well-thought-out plan. The next few days, Olga lived in a state of constant nervous tension. During the day, she went to work. In the evening, she cooked dinner, talked to Alexei about the weather and household trifles, while inside, she shrank from fear and disgust. Every time he touched her, she wanted to recoil and scream, but she couldn't show it. Not a single hint that she knew something. She began to notice strange details that had previously escaped her attention. Alexei often stayed late at work 3 or 4 times a week. He said overtime, important order, helping the night shift. Olga had believed unquestioningly before. Now, every delay seemed suspicious. Where did he really go in the evenings? Once, she pretended to fall asleep early and hid in the dark, watching. Alexei quietly got out of bed around 11 p.m., thinking she was asleep, and went to the kitchen. Olga cautiously cracked the bedroom door open. He stood by the window, smoking and staring into the distance. In profile, his face was completely different, hard, focused, devoid of the softness he usually showed. "Who are you, Alexei? Who are you really?" Olga decided she had to follow him one of those evenings when he stayed late at work. It was risky, but there was no other way. She needed proof, real, tangible proof that could be presented to the police. The opportunity came on Wednesday. Alexei said over breakfast that he'd be late today. Needed to help unload machines arriving in the evening. Olga nodded as usual, but inside, everything froze with determination. Today she'd learn the truth. After work, she didn't go home. She took an old dark coat she hadn't worn in a long time, tied a scarf to hide her hair, took a bus to the stop near the machine building plant, and waited in the shadow of the factory wall. Time dragged on agonizingly slowly. Workers came out in groups. The shift ended. Among them was Alexei. Olga instinctively shrank into the shadows, though in the twilight and at such a distance, he couldn't see her. Alexei didn't head to the bus stop as usual. He went in the opposite direction, where the industrial zone began beyond the railway tracks. Olga followed him, keeping a safe distance. Her heart pounded so loudly that it seemed the whole block could hear it. Alexei walked confidently, without looking back, clearly on a familiar route, crossed the railway tracks, turned around the corner of an old brick building, and there they were. 3 large hangars covered in rust and peeling paint, windows boarded up with planks, doors locked. The place looked abandoned, dead, the perfect place to hide something or someone. Alexei headed to the middle hangar, pulled a bunch of keys from his pocket, unlocked the massive padlock, and disappeared inside, closing the door behind him. Olga stood around the corner of the neighboring building, shivering from the cold and fear. What should she do? Approach closer? Try to peek inside? But how, if he noticed her? She just stood there, in the thickening twilight, staring at the hangar, behind whose walls might lie the solution to a 7-year mystery, or perhaps something much more terrible than she could imagine. Olga stood in the shadows for about 20 minutes. The cold October wind pierced to the bone, but she didn't feel the cold. Her entire being was focused on that hangar, on the closed door behind which her husband was hiding. What was he doing there? Why did he come here almost every evening, saying he was staying late at work? Finally, the door cracked open. Alexei came out, locked the padlock again, and headed back toward the railway tracks. Olga pressed against the wall, holding her breath. He walked past without noticing her in the darkness. His footsteps faded, dissolving into the evening hum of the city. Olga waited another 5 minutes to make sure he'd really left, then cautiously emerged from cover. She approached the hangar. Massive metal door, padlock, boarded up windows. No sounds from inside. Dead silence. She circled the building. On the side, she found a narrow window almost under the roof, the only one not boarded up, too high to peek through, just like that. Olga looked around and found several rusty metal crates, apparently left over from the war years, dragged them to the wall, stacked them on top of each other, checking for sturdiness. The structure wobbled but held. Carefully, holding onto the wall, Olga climbed the improvised ladder. The crates creaked under her weight, threatening to collapse any second. Finally, she reached window level. The glass was dirty, covered in years of dust. But through it, the interior of the hangar was visible. What she saw made her clutch the window frame to keep from falling. Inside the hangar burned a single bulb under a tin lampshade. The dim light snatched fragments from the darkness. Concrete floor, metal shelves along the walls, some crates and tools. And in the far corner, a massive door, clearly leading to a basement. That very door with metal sheathing and a heavy bolt. But the main thing wasn't that. On one of the shelves, Olga made out neatly stacked things. Women's clothing, shoes, bags. Lots of things, too many for one person. And next to it, that very leather album, exactly like the one she'd found under the floorboard. Or maybe it was a second copy? Olga's head spun. She convulsively inhaled the cold air, trying to cope with the rising panic. It's true, all of it true. Alexei is hiding something horrific. Suddenly she heard a sound, someone's cry, muffled, as if coming from underground. A woman's voice. The words couldn't be made out, but the intonation was unmistakable. Despair, plea, fear. The cry came from the basement. The crates under Olga's feet creaked pitifully. She tried to shift her weight, but it was too late. The top crate tilted, the structure collapsed with a crash, and Olga flew down. She instinctively tried to tuck in, but still hit the ground hard on her side. Sharp pain pierced her ribs. She lay there for several seconds, trying to catch her breath. A ringing silence surrounded her, and then it hit her. The crash of the fall must have been heard inside the hangar. If someone was there, Olga jumped up, overcoming the pain, and ran away. She ran without choosing a path, across the railway tracks, past factory buildings, until she reached a lit street. Only there did she stop, lean against the wall of a residential building, breathing heavily. People passed by without paying attention to the disheveled woman in a dirty coat. The city lived its ordinary evening life. Someone hurried home from work, someone walked dogs, sounds of radio and smells of dinner wafted from windows. Normal, familiar life. And she had just peeked into hell. Home. Olga returned later than Alexei. He was already there, sitting in the kitchen with a newspaper and a mug of tea, greeting her with his usual calm demeanor. I was starting to worry. Where did you get held up? Olga took off her coat, trying not to let him notice the dirt and tears in the fabric. I stopped by Elena Ivanovna, the neighbor from the fifth entrance. She fell ill and asked me to run to the pharmacy. The lie came surprisingly easily, maybe because the truth was too terrible to say aloud. How is she? Alexei took a sip of tea, without looking up from the newspaper. She says it's a bit better. Age, ailments. Olga went to the bathroom, locked herself in, turned on the water, and only then allowed herself to tremble. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Pale face, dilated pupils, a scrape on her cheek from the fall. Who is this woman? Just a few days ago, she was an ordinary accountant, a widow of lost hope, a quiet person with a quiet life. And now she knew that in the basement of that hangar, someone was there. Women, possibly her sister Dasha, living people held there against their will, and that someone was her husband. No, she still couldn't fully believe it. Alexei, her Alexei, who brought her tea when she was sick, who stroked her head when she cried, who helped search for Dasha, driving to hospitals and police stations. Maybe there's some explanation? Maybe he's conducting an investigation too, and just isn't telling her? Maybe. But no logical explanation could justify a secret album with photos of frightened women. No explanation could justify the cry from the basement. Olga washed her face with cold water, composed herself, and left the bathroom. At dinner, Alexei was, as usual, talking about the factory, about how the foreman had finally quit drinking, about plans for the weekend. Olga nodded, answered automatically. Inside, certainty grew. She couldn't go to the police without proof. They'd think she was crazy. A woman obsessed with searching for her missing sister starts suspecting her own husband. That's how it would look from the outside. She needed more. irrefutable facts. The next 2 days, Olga spent in the library, studying old newspapers, looking for reports of missing women over the past years. And she found them. God, how many she found! Natalia Krylova, 32 years old, disappeared in June of that year. Worked as a seamstress at a textile factory, left home in the evening, and didn't return. Irina Rebrikova, 28 years old, vanished in August. Saleswoman in a grocery store, last seen at a bus stop. Tamara Kozlova, 35 years old, disappeared in November. Librarian, left work and dissolved into thin air. In total, over the past 7 years, 14 women had vanished without a trace in the city and its surroundings. 14. Olga wrote down all the names, dates, circumstances. Some names matched those written in the album. The picture was forming into something monstrous. Women disappeared with a certain periodicity, about every few months. All were between 20 and 40 years old, all single or living separately from relatives, and all vanished without a trace, without any leads. But how did Alexei choose his victims? How did he meet them? And most importantly, what monstrous motive drove him? Olga remembered how she and Alexei had met. It was 8 years ago, shortly after their mother died. Olga worked at the factory, lived with her sister in a room in a communal apartment. Money was short. Life was hard. Alexei appeared like salvation. Reliable, hard-working, with a good salary and a separate apartment. He courted her persistently but gently, gave flowers, took her to the movies, said the right words. 6 months later, they married. Dasha stayed living in the communal apartment then. Alexei's apartment had only 1 room. It was impossible to fit 3. Olga visited her sister regularly, but less often than before. New family life, duties as a wife, home, and then she disappeared a year after their wedding. Coincidence? Or had Alexei deliberately chosen Olga, knowing about her sister, knowing that a young, lonely girl living separately would be easy prey? The thought made Olga nauseous. She ran out of the reading room, barely making it to the restroom before she vomited. Then she stood for a long time, clutching the cold tile wall, trying to pull herself together. That evening, Olga made a decision. She had to get inside that hangar. She had to see what was really happening there. She had to learn the truth, no matter how terrible. And only then would she go to the police with proof that couldn't be refuted. But how to get inside? Alexei had the keys. He carried them with him. She couldn't break the lock. The windows were boarded up. Only Olga remembered that narrow window under the roof. It wasn't boarded up. Was it big enough to crawl through? Hard to say, but worth trying. She began preparing, pulling out Alexei's old pants from the closet, the ones he hadn't worn in ages, a dark sweater, found a flashlight, checked the batteries, took a small but sharp knife from the kitchen just in case. If there really was someone there, someone dangerous. 2 days later, Alexei said again that he'd be late at work. Olga nodded as usual, saw him to the door, kissed him goodbye. This kiss was the hardest of all. Then she quickly changed, took the prepared things, and headed to the hangars. She waited until it got dark, hid in the shadow of the abandoned building opposite, watching. Alexei came, as last time, unlocked the door, and went inside. The light in the window under the roof turned on. Olga waited 20 minutes to make sure he wouldn't come out right away, and began acting. She approached the side wall of the hangar where that window was. This time, she brought a rope and hook from the home shed where junk was stored. She threw the hook several times unsuccessfully until it finally caught on something on the roof. Olga pulled the rope, checking its strength. It seemed to hold. She'd never climbed ropes, but now adrenaline and desperation gave her strength. She began climbing centimeter by centimeter, scraping her palms on the rough hemp, scratching against the brickwork, finally reaching the window. It turned out to be a bit wider than it seemed from below. Olga pulled out the knife, slipped the blade between the frame and glass, pressed. The old putty gave way easily. The glass swung inward with a quiet creak. Now, the main thing was to crawl through. The window was narrow, but Olga was thin. 7 years of constant stress had done their job. She pushed her head and shoulders through, then the rest of her body. For a second, she got stuck at the hips. Panic washed over her in a wave, but she twisted. Something tore on the pants, and she fell inside. The fall was short, just a couple of meters to the top of a tall shelf. Olga landed on something soft, a pile of old rags. Fortunately, she held her breath, listening. Silence. Only somewhere below in the basement came muffled voices. Olga carefully climbed down from the shelf, took out the flashlight but didn't turn it on. Light could give her away. Her eyes gradually adjusted to the semi-darkness. The scant light from the single lamp allowed her to make out the outlines of objects. Olga moved toward the far corner, where the basement door was. With each step, the voices became clearer. One voice was male, familiar to the point of pain. Alexei, speaking in a calm, almost affectionate tone. And in response, women's voices, several, pleading, frightened. Olga approached the door. It was ajar a few centimeters. Cold sweat covered her forehead. One more step, and she'd see what couldn't be unseen, what would change everything forever. She peered through the crack between the door and the jamb, and the world collapsed completely. In the basement burned several kerosene lamps. Electricity apparently hadn't been run there. The yellow flickering light snatched a nightmarish picture from the darkness. The room was divided into several sections by rough wooden partitions. In each section, an iron cot, a bucket, a few old blankets. Women sat on the cots. Olga counted 5. All in worn home clothes, with dull hair, pale faces. Some sat staring into emptiness. One cried quietly, another rocked back and forth, hugging herself. And in the middle of the basement stood Alexei, her husband, the man with whom she had shared a bed for 8 years. He held a bowl of some food in his hands and spoke to the women in the same soft voice he usually used with Olga. "Come on, Tamarushka, you need to eat. You need strength. Guests are coming tomorrow. You need to look good." One of the women, thin, emaciated, with bruises under her eyes, shook her head. "I don't want to. Please let me go, and I won't tell anyone. I swear, I'm Tamara. We've discussed this." Alexei sighed like a father patiently explaining to a disobedient child. "You know the rules. You're needed here. You all are. This is your new life. The sooner you accept it, the easier it'll be." Olga felt nauseous. She clamped her hand over her mouth so the scream wouldn't escape. Alexei continued talking, moving from one woman to another, checking their condition like a caring jailer inspecting prisoners. And then Olga saw her. In the far corner, on the last cot, sat a woman turned to the wall. Dark hair, once thick, now dull and tangled. Thin shoulders under a faded sweater. But Olga would recognize that silhouette out of 1,000. Dasha, her sister, alive after 7 years. Olga didn't remember how the cry escaped, didn't remember how she flung the door open and rushed down the stairs. She only remembered how Alexei turned, and for a split second, something reflected on his face. Surprise, annoyance, and then cold fury. "Olga." His voice was calm, too calm. "How did you?" But she ran to the far cot, to her sister, and she turned at the noise, and Olga saw her face, gaunt, aged 10 years, with a faded gaze. But it was Dasha, her Dashenka. "Dasha." Olga fell to her knees by the cot, grabbed her sister's hands. "It's me. It's Olenka. God, you're alive? You're alive?" And she looked at her, with a long, empty gaze, then slowly, as if recalling something from a very distant past, whispered, "Olga, yes, yes, it's me." Tears streamed down Olga's face. "I've been looking for you so long. 7 years. Dasha, 7 years. Olga." Dasha repeated, and suddenly grabbed her sister by the shoulders with unexpected strength. "Run! Run from here! Right now!" But she didn't finish. A strong hand landed on Olga's shoulder and sharply turned her. Alexei stood over them, and in the dim light of the kerosene lamps, his face seemed like that of a stranger, cold, hard, devoid of any warmth. "How did you get in here, Olenka?" He spoke quietly, but steel rang in his voice. "Were you following me?" "Figured it out." Olga stood up, instinctively shielding her sister. Her hand felt the knife in her pocket, that very kitchen knife she'd taken from home. "Let them go." Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak firmly. "Or what? You'll go to the police? Tell them your husband is a criminal?" He took a step closer. "And they'll believe you? An obsessed woman who for 7 years has been searching for her missing sister and finally lost her mind completely. There are clues here." Olga stepped back, pressing her back to the wall. 5 women, they'll tell. Their testimonies will be enough to... What? Alexei laughed. It was something new. Olga had never seen such a smirk on his face. "Olenka, dear Olenka, foolish Olenka, you think I'm alone? You think I have no protectors?" He pulled a bunch of keys from his pocket, toyed with them. "See these keys? One is to the office of the city police chief. Know why? Because the respected Dmitry Sergeyevich is my partner, just like Prosecutor Smirnov and Judge Popov and 7 other respected people in this city. They're all my friends. They all visit this place. They all enjoy the services of these sweet ladies." Olga heard Dasha quietly sob behind her. The other women in their cages stirred too, crying. "Quiet. They've heard this before. It's become part of their nightmare." "You're lying," Olga whispered, though deep down she already knew he wasn't. It explained so much. Why the police didn't take the disappearances seriously. Why all investigations dead-ended. Why? "I never lied to you, Olenka." Alexei took another step. Now there was less than a meter between them. "I really loved you in my own way. You were a good wife. Exemplary. Just the kind needed for cover. Who would suspect a family man, a model worker, a husband who helps his wife search for her missing sister? You married me because of Dasha." Olga finally said aloud what she'd realized yesterday in the library. "You wanted her from the very beginning. Wanted to get her. Clever girl." Alexei nodded almost approvingly. "I saw you together once at the market. You were buying vegetables, and Dasha was with you, so beautiful, so alive. And I thought, here's the perfect one. But just approaching her would be too risky. A girl might remember, tell someone, but through her sister, through the caring older sister who'd be happy to marry off the younger to a decent man." He fell silent, reminiscing. "Everything worked out perfectly. I married you, gained trust, learned everything about your family, where Dasha works, what routes she takes, and then just waited for the right moment. Dance evening at the House of Culture. Excellent opportunity. I met her at the bus stop. Said you sent me to pick her up, that you were feeling unwell. She got in the car without question." Olga felt something dying slowly inside her. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of life with this man. All that time, he knew where Dasha was, what was being done to her, and lied every day, looking straight in the eyes. And the others? Her voice sounded alien, mechanical. "Each has her own story," Alexei shrugged. "Some, like your sister, fell for the trick. Some just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We only take loners, those no one will particularly miss. You know how many like that in our city after the war? Widows, orphans, women without family. They're made to disappear without a trace." He spoke about it in such an everyday tone, as if discussing the weather or market prices. Olga looked at him and couldn't believe that she'd once considered this man her salvation, her support. "Does your conscience torment you?" she asked. Alexei thought, as if really considering the question. No. Probably something in me broke a long time ago, back in the war. Maybe I saw so much death, so much suffering, and at some point realized, the world is cruel. The strong survive in it. I'm strong, they're weak. That's it. No higher meaning, no divine justice, just the right of the strong." One of the women in the cage groaned. Alexei turned to her. "Quiet, Natalia, or do you want me to call Pavel? He's in a bad mood today." The woman sobbed and fell silent, huddling on the cot. Olga realized she had to do something. Right now, immediately, before Alexei called those partners he'd mentioned, before she and Dasha and all these unfortunate women ended up in even greater danger. Her fingers clenched on the knife handle in her pocket. Alexei! She tried to make her voice softer, pleading, "Please, I won't go to the police. I won't tell anyone. Just let us go with Dasha. We'll leave the city. You'll never see us again. I promise." He looked at her with something like pity. "Olenka, do you really think I can let you go? Do you think my partners will allow it? You know too much now, much more than you should." He reached out his hand, clearly intending to grab her. And at that moment, Olga pulled out the knife and struck. She aimed for the chest, but Alexei recoiled at the last moment, and the blade slid along his arm, leaving a long, bloody trail. He roared in pain and rage, grabbed her by the wrist. His fingers clenched like a vice. Olga felt her bones cracking under the pressure. "Bitch," he growled, twisting her arm. "You dared?" The knife fell from her weakening fingers. It clinked on the concrete floor. Alexei shoved Olga, and she fell, hitting the back of her head against the wall. The world swam. Through the haze, she saw him picking up the knife, his face twisting with malice. And suddenly, there was a loud knock from somewhere above. The sound of an opening door, voices, footsteps. "Alexei, you there? What's the noise?" A male voice, unfamiliar to Olga. Alexei froze, turned his head toward the stairs. Anger and confusion reflected on his face. "Pavel," he exhaled. "I thought you'd come later. Got free earlier. Decided to drop by. What's going on here?" This was her only chance. Olga forced herself to get up, overcoming the dizziness. Grabbed Dasha by the hand. "Run!" They rushed to the stairs. Alexei tried to block the way, but Olga pushed him with a force she didn't know she had. He staggered, and they ran past, flying up the steps. At the top, they were met by an unfamiliar man, fat, balding, in a good suit, clearly not from the working class. He stared at them in amazement. "What the hell? Help!" Olga screamed. "He's holding us against our will. There are more women down there. Help!" For a second, she naively hoped he'd help. But the man exchanged a glance with Alexei, hurrying after them, and laughed. "New batch of goods? Alexei, are you in such a hurry that you didn't even deliver them to the place?" Olga understood. This was one of the partners, one of those she didn't think, just ran, dragging Dasha behind her, who could barely stand after years in the basement. They burst out of the hangar into the cold night darkness. Behind them came shouts, footsteps, swearing. They ran through the industrial zone, stumbling over rails, scraping hands on rusty fences. Olga didn't know where she was running. She only knew she had to run, escape, survive. They reached the highway where rare cars sped by. Olga forced herself to stop, looked back. No one, not yet. But they'd come. Of course they'd come. Dasha. She hugged her sister, pressed her to herself. "Hold on. We have to find help. Real help." But where? Where to go if the police were under the control of these people? If the whole city was their territory? Dasha trembled in her arms. She was so exhausted, so weak. 7 years in the basement. 7 years. "Olga," her sister whispered. "There are others left there. We can't leave them. Tamra, Natalia, they..." "I know." Olga squeezed her hands. "We'll come back for them. I promise. But first we need help. We need to find someone we can trust." A single thought swirled in her head. Who? Who could be trusted in a city where judges, prosecutors, and police were part of this nightmare? The cold October wind whipped her face. Olga and Dasha stood on the shoulder of the deserted highway, and every passing car made them flinch. What if it's them? What if Alexei had already organized a chase? In a city where the police chief was his partner, where judges and prosecutors were part of the criminal network, they were defenseless. Olga hugged her trembling sister tighter. Dasha could barely stand. 7 years in the basement had turned her into a shadow of her former self. But she was alive after all these years. Alive. The question was simple and terrifying. What to do next? Going to the police was useless. Turning to the prosecutor's office, they were in on it too. Flee the city. But where? Olga had no money for tickets, no documents for Dasha. All her things were left in that apartment where Alexei lived, and fleeing meant leaving the other women in the basement to fate. Tamara, Natalia, Irina, two more whose names Olga hadn't had time to learn. 5 living people who were right now sitting in cages, knowing that the only hope for salvation had just escaped. Where are we going? Dasha's voice was hoarse, uncertain. For 7 years, she had barely spoken, only whispering with the other prisoners. Her vocal cords were unaccustomed to loud sounds. I don't know, Olga admitted honestly. But we'll figure something out, I promise. She looked back. In the distance, the lights of the industrial zone, where the hangar was, could be seen. No one visible yet, but it wouldn't last long. Alexei wasn't the man to just let them go. He knew Olga had seen everything, knew she could tell it all. For him and his partners, she had become a mortal threat. Suddenly, Olga had an idea. Father Nikolai, the priest from the Pokrov church on the other end of the city. He was the only person who had continued helping her search for Dasha even when everyone else had given up. The old priest, who had survived the war and repressions, had often given shelter to those in need. If anyone could be trusted in this city, it was him. Dasha, we need to get to the church. Olga helped her sister walk along the shoulder. There's a man there who'll help us. The way took more than an hour. Dasha walked slowly, stopping every few minutes to catch her breath. Olga supported her, and with each step, the same thought swirled in her head. How could she not have noticed? 8 years next to a monster, 8 years sharing a bed with him, cooking his food, believing every word. And all that time, he kept her sister in a cage, brought his partners there, turned women's lives into a commodity. When they finally reached the church, it was well past midnight. The wooden domes darkened against the starry sky. The church was locked, but next to it stood a small house, Father Nikolai's residence. Light burned in the window. Olga knocked on the door, first quietly, then louder. Finally, footsteps sounded from inside, and the door cracked open. In the opening appeared the face of the elderly priest, gray beard, kind but tired eyes. Olga, he looked at her in surprise, then shifted his gaze to Dasha, and his eyes widened. Lord, this is Dasha, your sister, Father Nikolai. Olga's voice trembled. We need help, urgently. The priest didn't ask questions, just flung the door wide. Come in quickly. Inside it was warm and smelled of old books and incense. Father Nikolai seated them by the stove, threw a warm blanket over Dasha, brought hot tea with honey, and only then quietly asked, what happened? Olga told everything, from the found album to the basement, from the names of the missing women to the names of those holding them. She spoke quickly, incoherently, but Father Nikolai listened attentively, without interrupting. His face paled with each minute. When she finished, a heavy silence hung in the room. Father Nikolai sat with his hands folded on his knees, staring into emptiness. Then he slowly crossed himself. Lord, forgive us sinners. I knew something was wrong in this city. Too many people vanished without a trace. But to this extent, that the guardians of the law themselves, what should I do? Olga looked at him pleadingly. Where to go? Who to turn to? The priest pondered. His fingers toyed with the rosary, an old habit to focus. The city police won't help you. That's clear. But there's the regional directorate. Different people there, different structure. The head of the regional NKVD, Colonel Kozlov. I know him. He's an honest, principled man. During the war, we were together. Yes, he waved his hand. A long story. The main thing is, he can be trusted. But how to get to him? The regional center is 100 kilometers from here. I have no money for tickets, no documents for Dasha. I'll help. Father Nikolai stood up. I have some small savings, enough for tickets, and I'll write a letter to Kozlov, explain the situation. It'll give weight to your words. He approached the old writing desk, took out paper and pen, wrote for a long time, carefully choosing words. Olga sat next to Dasha, holding her hand. Her sister dozed off, leaning on her shoulder. A semblance of peace finally appeared on her emaciated face, but Olga couldn't calm down. Thoughts raced. Alexei was surely looking for them now. He might already know they'd gone to the church. In this city, he had eyes everywhere. Every minute of delay increased the danger. Father Nikolai finished the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to Olga, along with a wad of crumpled bills. The first bus to the regional center leaves at 6 a.m. Get to the bus station, buy tickets, and go. The sooner you leave this city, the better. And I'll try to gather more evidence here. Talk to relatives of the missing women. Find those who saw something suspicious. It's dangerous. Olga shook her head. If they find out you're helping us, I'm an old man. My children. The priest smiled sadly. I've survived worse. The Lord will give strength. The main thing is to save those unfortunates still in the basement. Every hour of delay could cost them their lives. Olga knew he was right. Alexei and his partners now understood their secret was out. What would they do with the living witnesses? Of course, try to eliminate the evidence. And the evidence was 5 women locked in cages. She spent the rest of the night in anxious half-sleep, flinching at every sound. Dasha slept nearby, curled up under the warm blanket. Father Nikolai sat by the window, peering into the darkness. He too felt the danger. Exactly at 4:30 a.m., the priest woke them. Time. Go through the yards, not the main streets. And at the station, stay in the crowd. Don't attract attention. Olga helped Dasha up. Her sister was a bit livelier after a few hours of sleep and hot tea, but still unsteady, as if not believing the nightmare was really over. They stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. The city still slept, only a few lights burned in windows. Early passers-by headed to work. Olga led Dasha through narrow alleys, trying to stay in the shadows. Every oncoming person seemed a threat, every car a pursuit. The bus station met them with noise and bustle. People with suitcases and bags crowded at the counters. Some dozed on benches, some smoked at the entrance. Olga bought 2 tickets to the regional center, and they sat in the far corner of the waiting room, trying not to stand out. 20 minutes until departure. The longest 20 minutes of Olga's life. She didn't take her eyes off the entrance, expecting Alexei or police or one of his partners to appear any second. They'd find them, grab them, and that was it. The end. But the minutes dragged on, and no one appeared. People kept buying tickets, boarding buses, leaving on their business. An ordinary morning of an ordinary day. Finally, boarding was announced. Olga helped Dasha up, and they headed to the bus. An old battered paths with cracked windows and peeling paint, but for them, it was a ship of salvation. They took seats at the very back of the salon. Olga clutched the bag with Father Nikolai's letter to her chest. This envelope was their only hope, the only proof they were telling the truth. The bus engine started with a strained roar. A few more passengers jumped in at the last moment. The driver closed the door, shifted gears, and then Olga saw him. Alexei stood at the bus station entrance, tall, broad-shouldered in his work jacket. He scanned the crowd, clearly looking for someone. His gaze slid over the bus windows. Olga instinctively ducked her head, pulling Dasha with her. Her heart pounded wildly. Had he seen them? Would he stop the bus in time? Several seconds stretched into eternity. Then the bus pulled away, slowly driving off the platform. Olga cautiously peeked out the window. Alexei was still standing there, but the bus was already picking up speed, exiting onto the highway. They were leaving, abandoning the city where they'd lived their whole lives. A city that turned out to be a trap, a prison with invisible walls. Dasha leaned on her shoulder. We escaped. For now. Yes, but this is just the beginning. We need to get to the regional center, find this Colonel Kozlov, convince him to believe us, and then we'll return. Return for the others. She thought again of those women in the basement, of Tamara who begged to be let go, of Natalia who shrank into the corner at every sound. They were there now, possibly already knowing 2 prisoners had escaped, knowing their fate now hung by a thread. Alexei wouldn't leave them alive. Too dangerous, too many witnesses. He'd eliminate the evidence, all the evidence. If Olga and Dasha didn't make it in time, those women would die. The bus rolled along the highway, leaving the awakened city behind. Olga looked out the window at the receding landscape and felt something new hardening inside her. Not fear, not confusion, resolve. Cold, firm resolve. She was no longer the naive woman who had lived 8 years in the illusion of a happy marriage. That Olga died the moment she opened the hidden album. That Olga stayed under the floorboard with the last remnants of trust in the world. Now she was someone else. Someone who had seen hell and escaped it. Someone who knew the truth about the world. Monsters don't live in fairy tales. They live nearby, where human faces speak in affectionate voices, and no one will protect you from them if you don't protect yourself. The regional center greeted them with the noise and bustle of a big city. There were more cars here, taller buildings, faster pace of life. People rushed about their business, paying no attention to 2 tired women getting off the bus. Olga held Dasha's hand, afraid to lose her in the crowd. Her sister was overwhelmed. 7 years in a basement, and then suddenly so much space, so many people, so many sounds. She clung to Olga like a frightened child. They found a cab driver, an elderly man with a kind face, and asked him to take them to the regional NKVD building. The driver glanced at them curiously, but said nothing. Apparently, over the years of work, he'd seen all sorts. The NKVD building was massive, gray, imposing. Guards in uniform stood at the entrance. Olga pulled Father Nikolai's letter from her bag and approached one of them. "I need to see Colonel Kozlov. It's urgent. A matter of life and death." The guard skeptically eyed her, the disheveled woman in a dirty coat, and her even more pitiful companion. "Do you have a summons? Documents? Here's a letter from Father Nikolai. He's personally acquainted with the colonel. Please, it's really important." The guard took the letter, turned it in his hands, then sighed. "Wait here." He disappeared inside the building. Olga and Dasha remained standing at the entrance. Passers-by cast curious glances at them. Time dragged agonizingly slowly. Olga began to get nervous. What if they refused? What if the colonel was too busy, or worse, what if he was connected to Alexei's criminal group? No, Father Nikolai wouldn't send them to someone he wasn't sure of. The priest had risked his life helping them. He couldn't be wrong. Finally, the guard returned. "The colonel will see you. Follow me." They walked through long corridors with portraits of leaders and slogans on the walls, went up to the 3rd floor. The guard knocked on a massive door with a plaque Colonel Kozlov and opened it. "Visitors, Comrade Colonel, let them in," came a thick male voice. Olga and Dasha entered. The office was strict, functional. A heavy writing desk, shelves with folders, a map of the region on the wall, a portrait of the leader. Behind the desk sat a man of about 50, with military bearing, gray temples, and attentive gray eyes. A hard face, but not cruel. A man who had been through the war and seen much. "Sit down." He pointed to chairs opposite the desk. "I read Father Nikolai's letter. He writes about some serious crimes in your city. Abductions of women, corruption in local authorities. This is a serious accusation. Very serious." Olga sat, helping Dasha settle, took a breath. "Comrade Colonel, everything in the letter is true, and even more. My sister, she disappeared 7 years ago. I found her yesterday. My husband held her in the basement of an abandoned hangar, along with 4 other women. He and his accomplices, they used these women. And the accomplices are the city police chief, the prosecutor, the judge, a whole network of influential people." The colonel leaned back in his chair, folded his fingers into a steeple. His face remained impassive, but his eyes studied them closely. "You understand the accusations you're making. If it's a lie, you'll face serious responsibility for slandering state officials. It's not a lie." Olga's voice trembled, but she tried to speak firmly. "I have proof. An album with photos of the captives, my sister's testimony, and 4 more women living witnesses who are right now in that basement. If we don't hurry, the criminals will get rid of them." Kozlov shifted his gaze to Dasha. She sat with her head down, trembling all over. Shackle marks were visible on her hands, dark bruises and scars, marks on her neck too. "What's your name, girl?" The colonel's voice softened. "Dasha," she whispered barely audibly. "Dasha Ivanova. Dasha, look at me." He waited until she raised her eyes. "Were you really held against your will?" "Yes." Tears streamed down her face. 7 years. 7 years in a cage. They came. Different people every week. And did. She couldn't continue, bursting into sobs. Olga hugged her, pressed her close. The colonel silently pulled a clean handkerchief from the desk drawer, handed it to Dasha, then pressed a button on the desk. Internal line. "Anna Sergeyevna, come to my office and bring Major Ivanov." A minute later, an elderly woman in a white coat, apparently the doctor, and a middle-aged military man with metal ribbons on his chest entered. "Anna Sergeyevna, examine the girl. Document all injuries," Kozlov ordered. "Major, record the testimony in detail with all particulars." The next 2 hours passed in interrogations. Olga told everything from beginning to end. How she found the album, how she spied on Alexei, how she broke into the hangar, what she saw there. She named all the names, the abducted women, and the criminals. Dasha was examined, her bruises, traces of prolonged confinement and starvation documented. Her testimony was recorded especially carefully. Colonel Kozlov listened silently, making notes. When they finished, he sat for a long time in thought, looking at the scribbled sheets. "I understand why Father Nikolai sent you to me," he finally said. "If even half of what you told is true. A criminal group with very serious cover has formed in your city. Police chief, prosecutor, judge. That means the entire law enforcement system there is under control. Any investigation attempts at the local level would be doomed." "So, you believe us?" Olga was afraid to hope. "I'll check." Kozlov stood, walked to the window. "You say your husband held her for 7 years. That means there was a missing person report. I'll request the file from the archive, see how the investigation was conducted. If there's really negligence or sabotage there, that's the first lead. I'll also check info on the other missing women. If that many people really vanished in the city without proper investigation, it's already a systemic problem." He turned to them. "But the main thing is to save the women still in the basement in time. You're right. If the criminals realize they've been exposed, they'll try to destroy the evidence. Living witnesses are the most dangerous evidence." "What will you do?" Olga asked. "I'll organize an operation." Kozlov returned to the desk, began making notes. "I'll take a group of vetted people from the regional directorate. No one from the local police should know about the raid in advance. Full secrecy. We'll leave this evening. Conduct the arrest at night. I'll go with you." Olga stood up. "I have to be there. I have to help those women." "No," Kozlov shook his head. "Too dangerous. You'll stay here, under guard. Your husband is looking for you now. He may have connections here in the regional center too. Can't risk it. But that's not up for discussion." His voice hardened. "You've done your part, delivered the information. Now it's my job to act. Your task is to stay alive, to testify in court later." Olga wanted to argue, but realized it was pointless. The colonel was right. She wasn't a fighter, not an operative. In that operation, she'd only be a burden. Kozlov called the guards. "House the women in a secure facility. Enhanced guard. No one in without my permission. And call a doctor. The girl needs medical help." They were led to a small room on the 4th floor. Clean, modest, 2 beds, table, chairs, barred windows. 2 guards stood at the door. The doctor came, brought medicine for Dasha, examined her again. Then food was brought. Hot soup, bread, tea. Olga made Dasha eat, though she could barely swallow. Then she put her sister to bed. Dasha fell into a heavy sleep almost instantly. Her body demanded rest after so many years in captivity, but Olga couldn't calm down. She sat by the window, looking at the city below and thinking about those women in the basement, about Alexei, who was probably realizing now that everything was collapsing. about his accomplices, the city's influential people who were used to considering themselves untouchable. What would they do? Try to escape or, on the contrary, go on the offensive, using their connections to stop the investigation? Colonel Kozlov seemed an honest, decisive man. But would he have enough strength against the whole system? After all, Alexei hadn't mentioned partners for nothing. This wasn't just a few perverted criminals. It was a network, a structure, a system built over years, tentacles extended throughout the city. When it got dark, Olga saw through the window a column of cars leaving the NKVD building. 4 black Volgas and a truck with armed fighters. Kozlov wasn't joking about the operation. He really sent a whole group. Olga pressed her forehead to the cold glass, prayed for the first time in many years that they'd make it in time, that the women in the basement would survive this night, that the nightmare would finally end. But deep inside, a cold premonition lived. Everything was just beginning. The worst was yet to come. The clock on the wall ticked seconds with agonizing slowness. Olga sat in the semi-dark room, unable to close her eyes though her body demanded rest. Dasha slept nearby. For the first time in 7 years on a real bed, under clean blankets, in safety. But was this real safety, or just a temporary illusion that would crumble as soon as the system started protecting its own? Because that's exactly what was happening now, at this very moment, somewhere 100 kilometers away. Not just a clash between criminals and law enforcers. No, it was much more complicated. Kozlov, with his group, was going to break the system. A structure that had fused with the city, put roots in every authority office, every police corridor, and here's the key question that didn't give Olga peace. Can you defeat a system using the rules of that same system? Think about it. The city police chief is part of the criminal network. The prosecutor, who should initiate criminal cases, is too. The judge, who should pass sentences, and he's there. All links in the chain of command are rotten through. And now, one colonel from the regional center is trying to break that chain. Will he have enough power? Or will he himself become a victim of the mechanism that's bigger than any single person? Olga stood up, approached the window. The city beyond the glass lived its nightlife. Rare lights in windows, dim street lamps, lonely cars. Somewhere there, in that darkness, events were unfolding on which lives depended. Tamara, Natalia, Irina, and 2 other women whose names Olga hadn't even learned. What were they feeling now? Did they still hope, or had they long buried hope along with their own names, turning into faceless commodities for the entertainment of the powerful? Because that's how it worked. Not just a series of abductions by a lone maniac. No, it was a well-oiled system of consuming human lives. Alexei wasn't a psychopath driven by perverted desires. He was an entrepreneur in a monstrous market. He supplied goods, women to his partners, people who ran the city, and in return got cover, protection, freedom to act unhindered. How many such Alexeis existed in other cities? How many basements and hangars hid such secrets? And the most terrible thing, how many Olgas lived next to monsters without suspecting it? Dawn was breaking outside the window, gray, cold, unwelcoming. Olga checked the clock, 6 a.m. Kozlov's operation started deep in the night, around 2 or 3. So several hours had passed. Why no news? Why hadn't anyone come to say how it ended? Anxiety grew with every minute. Olga approached the door, knocked. One of the guards cracked it open. Something needed, comrade? Comrade Colonel hasn't returned. No news. The guard shook his head. Quiet so far. As soon as there's something, they'll tell you. The door closed. Olga returned to the window. The city was waking up. People went to work. Children ran to school. Buses carried passengers. An ordinary morning of an ordinary day. None of these people knew that somewhere right now, a question was being decided. Would justice continue to exist or be buried forever under a pile of service reports and fake protocols? Dasha woke around 8. Olga helped her wash, brought breakfast left by the guards. Her sister ate slowly, with difficulty. Her stomach was unaccustomed to normal food, after 7 years of meager rations. She barely spoke, only sometimes flinching at sharp sounds beyond the door, pressing into the corner. The trauma was deep, her psyche broken by years of confinement. How much time would it take for her to recover? Years of therapy? Decades? Or maybe some things never recover? Can you return a life to a person if they've stolen 7 years? 7 years of youth, hopes, future? At 9 a.m., the door flew open. In the doorway stood Major Ivanov, the same one who had recorded the testimonies yesterday. His face was gray with fatigue, uniform rumpled, a bruise mark on his cheek. "Get ready," he said curtly. "The colonel ordered to bring you. He wants you to identify the detainees." The operation was successful. The women are alive. The major hesitated, looking away. "Talk to the colonel. He'll explain everything." That tone, that averted gaze. Olga felt everything inside her clench with premonition. Something had gone wrong. Something had happened. They were put in a black Volga and driven back to the city. The road took almost 2 hours. Olga looked out the window at the familiar landscape fields, forests, villages, and didn't recognize it, as if she'd left one world and returned to another, parallel, distorted, where everything looked the same, but the essence had changed forever. The car entered the city and headed not to the hangars on the outskirts, but straight to the city police building. Military trucks stood at the entrance, people in regional NKVD uniforms, no local police in sight. They were led inside to an office on the second floor. Colonel Kozlov sat at a foreign desk. Apparently, this was the city police chief's office. Folders with documents, photos, some protocols lay before him. His face was stony. "Sit down," he pointed to chairs. He waited until they settled. "The operation is complete. We took the hangar by assault at 3 a.m. Met resistance. 2 guards were armed, opened fire. One of my men is wounded, non-critically. Both guards detained." He paused, and Olga understood. Now came what he'd held back for. In the basement, we found 3 women, alive, in serious condition, but alive. "They've already been taken to the hospital." 3? Olga's voice broke. "But there were 5. Tamara, Natalia, Irina, and 2 more." "I know." Kozlov ran a hand over his face. 2 we found in the far corner of the hangar, killed about 6 to 8 hours before our arrival. That is, last night, shortly after your escape. Silence. Olga heard Dasha quietly sob next to her. She covered her face with her hands, unable to look at the colonel. 2 women dead, 2 living witnesses eliminated, because Alexei realized he'd been exposed, because the system began defending itself by getting rid of the most dangerous evidence. Who? Who was killed? Olga barely managed to say. Kozlov checked the notes. Tamara Kozlova, 35 years old, and Irina Rebrikova, 28 years old, strangled. Judging by the marks done by a professional, quick, efficient, without extra torment. Not your husband. He has an alibi. One of the accomplices. Professional, efficient, as if talking not about murdering people, but eliminating production defects. That's how the system works, coldly, methodically, without emotion. Human lives are just numbers in a report, lines in a protocol for it. Your husband escaped, Kozlov continued. We checked your apartment empty, things packed. Apparently, he left the city right after you fled, wanted throughout the region, detained 2 of his accomplices, those guards in the hangar. They're giving testimony now, naming names. He pulled photos from the folder and laid them on the desk. Identify, please, these are people you saw in the basement, whom your husband named. Olga forced herself to look at the shots. The first face, a fat, balding man. That very Pavel, who came to the hangar that evening. Yes, I saw him. Alexei called him Pavel. Pavel Lebedev, city police chief. Kozlov nodded. Detained this morning at 6. Tried to flee in a service car. Intercepted at the city exit. Next photo. A man of about 50 with an intellectual face and glasses. I didn't see this one, but Alexei mentioned the prosecutor. Smirnov Vladimir Stepanovich, city prosecutor. Kozlov set the photo aside, also detained. Tried to pull strings in the regional prosecutor's office, block the investigation. Didn't work. My direct superior gave carte blanche. A few more photos. Judge Popov, an elderly man with a stern face, 2 deputy police chiefs, the city House of Culture director, the place where dances were often held, where Alexei scouted potential victims. 8 people in total, 8 respected citizens, pillars of society, people the city trusted with its safety, and all were part of this nightmare. How long had this been going on? Olga asked. We found records in the hangar. Kozlov opened a thick folder. Your husband kept a kind of accounting. Dates, names, amounts. Yes, they even took money from partners for access to the victims. According to these records, the first abduction happened 11 years ago. Since then, 23 women have disappeared. 23. Olga felt the room swimming around her. Where are the rest? We found a burial site. In the forest, 15 kilometers from the city. 17 bodies. The others, apparently, in other places. Interrogations continue. 17 graves. 17 lives cut short for someone's perverted desires. 17 families who waited years, hoped, searched, and here's the answer. A shallow pit in the forest, covered with branches and earth. Dasha cried quietly, burying her face in Olga's shoulder. She knew some of these women, saw how they were brought to the basement, saw how they broke, lost their minds, died bit by bit every day, and then simply vanished. They were led upstairs and never returned, and new ones came. Why didn't you save them sooner? Olga's voice was full of pain and anger. 23 disappearances over 11 years. How could this go unnoticed? Kozlov didn't look away, took the blow because the system worked for them. Every missing person report went to Police Chief Lebedev. He personally controlled the investigations, steered them into dead ends. Witnesses weren't properly questioned, evidence lost, cases closed for lack of corpus delicti. Several times, relatives of the missing tried to get justice. They were intimidated. Some were even arrested on fabricated charges. He sighed heavily. And those who still tried to go higher, to regional organs, their complaints settled on Prosecutor Smirnov's desk. He wrote responses that investigations were conducted properly. No grounds for reopening cases. Perfect defense. 3 levels: police, prosecutor's office, court, all under control. And no one noticed? No one got suspicious? They did. Kozlov nodded. Father Nikolai noticed. 2 years ago, he wrote a letter to the regional directorate asking for a check. I sent an inspection then. Know what they found? Exemplary work by the city police. All cases filed by the rules, all procedures followed. On paper, perfect. And the inspectors were personally met by Chief Lebedev. He showed them what needed showing, said what needed hearing. There it was. That's how the system worked. Not by brute force, not by obvious lawlessness. No, it acted subtly, through properly filed documents, through formal compliance with procedures, through mutual cover on all hierarchy levels. And breaking through that defense was almost impossible until someone from inside appeared. Someone like Olga, who accidentally peeked where she shouldn't have. What happens next? Olga asked. With the detainee's investigation, trial, sentence. Kozlov began gathering the photos. But it won't be quick. They all have connections and lawyers, means of defense. They'll try to pressure witnesses, intimidate, bribe. We must be ready for a long fight. And those 3 women you saved, will they testify? Elena Krylova agreed to give testimony. The other 2, he shook his head. One fell into catatonia, doesn't react to external stimuli. The second refuses to speak, fears revenge. And I understand her. Even behind bars, these people are dangerous. They have followers, friends, relatives at large. Olga thought of Alexei. He was out there somewhere, free, on the run, knew he was being searched for, that the net was tightening. What would he do? Try to disappear for good, or do something desperate? A man who built his monstrous empire for 11 years, wouldn't give up easily. He'd fight, and he knew where to strike hardest. He knew who posed the main threat to him. Olga and Dasha, the main witnesses, those who started the chain reaction that tore the whole system apart. And Alexei knew where to find them. Fear has a special property. It doesn't disappear after the immediate threat passes. On the contrary, it settles deep inside, turns into constant background noise that sounds even in moments of seeming calm. Olga learned this in the following days. She and Dasha were placed in a safe apartment on the outskirts of the regional center, round-the-clock guard, 2 policemen at the door, another in the yard, first-floor windows barred, phone disconnected. They were forbidden to go out unaccompanied. A cage, yes, of a sort, but a cage that protects rather than imprisons. At least, that's what they were told. Dasha spent most of her time in bed. A psychiatrist came to her, an elderly woman with a kind face who talked to her for hours, trying to reach the person under layers of trauma. Progress was slow. Dasha woke at night screaming, thrashed around the room, not understanding where she was. Sometimes she looked at Olga and didn't recognize her, called her by strangers' names, names of other captives she'd seen in the basement. The psyche defended itself the only way available, splitting, creating alternative realities where it was easier to exist. The doctor said it was temporary, that Dasha would recover over time. But Olga saw doubt in the specialist's eyes. Some wounds are too deep, and Olga couldn't afford the luxury of psychological shutdown. She had to remain strong, clear-headed, ready for the ongoing fight, because the fight was just beginning. Colonel Kozlov came every 2 or 3 days, brought news. The investigation progressed, but slowly. The detainees refused to admit guilt, hired the best lawyers they could find. Relatives of the detainees, many of whom also held influential positions, launched a campaign to discredit the investigation. Articles appeared in regional newspapers hinting at fabricated cases, abuse of power by the NKVD, violation of procedural norms. The system was defended by another system, larger, more influential, more tangled. They're trying to shift everything to the political plane, Kozlov explained, sitting in the kitchen over a cup of tea. They say it's abuse of authority, that I'm acting on my own, that arrests were made without due grounds, trying to portray the criminals as victims and us as executioners. But there is evidence. Olga couldn't believe it. 3 living women, 17 bodies in the forest, Alexei's records with names and dates. The lawyers challenge everything. They say the records are fabricated, that the women give testimony under pressure, that the bodies in the forest aren't linked to their clients. The legal machine is working full throttle. And the court, the judge from the regional center, unconnected to the detainees, is holding firm so far, not yielding to pressure, but they're already pressuring him from above. You know how it works? Calls from the capital, talks about career, hints at consequences. The system doesn't want it revealed how deep the corruption runs, because if you dig deeper, it'll turn out there aren't 1 or 2 such cities, that it's not an anomaly, but the norm. Olga listened and understood. They weren't fighting 8 criminals. They were fighting the principle of mutual cover that permeated the entire power vertical, where everyone covers for everyone, where exposing one threatens collapse for dozens of others, and they'd all fight to the last to prevent that collapse. And Alexei? Olga asked. Still not found. Kozlov shook his head. Vanished. Checked all stations, bus depots, roadblocks. No traces. Either he's very well hidden or someone's helping him. He has remaining connections, people not arrested who continue to act. He'll come for us. Olga voiced what she'd been thinking for days. He won't leave it like this. I know him. He's not the type to just run and hide. He'll take revenge. Kozlov didn't lie, didn't comfort with empty promises. Possibly. That's why you're under guard. That's why I insist you don't leave the apartment unless absolutely necessary. He's dangerous, your husband. We checked his biography. Served in intelligence during the war, underwent special training. He knows how to kill, how to hide, how to plan. Intelligence, special training. Olga remembered how she'd admired his calm, his rationality. his ability to find a way out of any situation. Those qualities she'd considered virtues of a family man were actually skills of a professional killer. And now those skills were aimed at her. At night, Olga lay sleepless, listening to every sound outside the window. Footsteps in the yard. This guard, or someone else? Creak of floorboards in the corridor, just an old building or someone's cautious steps? Every shadow outside the window seemed suspicious. Every unfamiliar voice on the street a threat. She now understood what Dasha had felt all those 7 years. Constant expectation of the worst, inability to relax, fear that becomes the background of existence, weaves into every second, turns life into survival. A week passed, then 2. Nothing happened. No attack attempts, no suspicious incidents. The guards began to relax. Duty policemen allowed themselves to doze at their post, got distracted by conversations among themselves. Routine kills vigilance. That's human nature. But Olga didn't relax. It felt too quiet. Alexei wasn't the type to give up. He planned, waited for his moment, and that moment would come. On the 16th day after their arrival in the regional center, Kozlov brought important news. The trial starts in a week. Olga and Dasha are the main prosecution witnesses. Your testimonies are critically important for the verdict. Without them, the case could collapse. You'll have to appear in court, the colonel explained. Give testimony under oath. Answer questions from the prosecutor and defense lawyers. It'll be hard. The lawyers will try to confuse you, catch you in contradictions, make you doubt your own memory. They're masters of their craft. I'm ready, Olga said firmly. I'll tell everything as it was. And Dasha. Olga looked at her sister, who sat by the window, staring blankly into space. The doctor said her condition had stabilized, but full recovery was far off. Could she withstand cross-examination, the pressure of the courtroom, face to face with those who turned her life into hell? I don't know, Olga admitted honestly. It seems it could break her completely. Kozlov nodded. I understand, but without her testimony, the case is much weaker. You're the sister, an interested party. The lawyers will play on that, say you're biased, that you want revenge on your husband for the failed marriage. But Dasha is a direct victim. Her testimony is irrefutable. Let me talk to her, Olga asked. That evening, she sat next to Dasha on the sofa, took her sister's hands. Dasha, listen to me. We need your help. The trial starts in a week. The people who held you will be there. And you need to tell what they did, so they're punished, so they can never harm other women again. Dasha slowly turned her head. Awareness flashed in her eyes for the first time in days. They'll be there. In the hall? Yes. Behind bars. Under guard. But yes, you'll see them. Dasha trembled. Her fingers clenched Olga's hands. I can't look at them. I can't. You can. Olga pressed her sister to her. You're stronger than you think. You survived. 7 years in hell, and you survived. And now you have a chance to make sure they pay for what they did. Don't miss it. A long pause. Dasha breathed raggedly, fighting fear. Then quietly, almost inaudibly, okay, I'll try. Olga hugged her tighter, knowing she was asking the impossible, but there was no other way. Justice demands sacrifices, and sometimes the victims themselves bring those sacrifices. The trial day began with thick fog. Olga and Dasha were driven to the courthouse in an armored car, accompanied by 6 armed guards. A crowd gathered at the entrance. Journalists with notebooks, curious citizens, relatives of the accused. The courtroom was packed. On the defendant's bench sat 8 people. Pavel Lebedev, former police chief, fat with sagging cheeks. Vladimir Smirnov, prosecutor, in glasses with an intellectual face. Judge Popov, elderly with gray in his hair. The other 5 sat with heads down. The judge declared the session open. The prosecutor began reading the indictment. Abduction of 23 women, unlawful deprivation of liberty, murder of 17 people. Behind every figure, a destroyed life, a broken family, years of pain. Olga was called first. She took the oath and began giving testimony. She spoke clearly, in detail about the 7 years of searching, the found album, spying on her husband, the horror she saw in the basement. The lawyers tried to throw her off with questions, confuse her, make her doubt, but Olga held firm. 3 hours of interrogation, and she didn't falter. After her, Dasha was called. Her sister walked to the stand slowly, pale, trembling. But when the prosecutor asked her to identify the guilty, Dasha raised her hand and pointed at 6 men in turn. They were all there. All of them. I remember each one. The lawyers pounced on her, trying to prove her memory unreliable, that she could be mistaken. But the psychiatrist confirmed. Dasha is sane. Her testimony is reliable, and the injuries match prolonged confinement. Then Elena Krylova, one of the rescued, was called. Thin, composed, she gave testimony calmly and mercilessly, named names, described events, told how they were beaten, how the disobedient were killed, how Lebedev personally ordered getting rid of women. The hall froze. Even the defendants' relatives fell silent, listening to these horrific details. Then came the expert testimonies. The criminologist confirmed the authenticity of Alexei's records. The forensic expert described the autopsy results of the 17 bodies, all killed by strangulation, traces of emaciation and beatings on the bodies. The evidence formed an irrefutable picture. On the 3rd day, the main evidence was brought into the hall, tapes. It turned out Alexei had filmed some of his partner's visits. When the lights dimmed and footage from that basement appeared on the wall, women in cages, men in expensive suits, the hall exploded. Someone screamed. Several people ran out, unable to bear it. One defendant's wife fainted. Lebedev, seeing himself on screen, collapsed face down on the table. Smirnov closed his eyes. Popov stared straight ahead, but his hands shook. They could no longer be called respected citizens. They had become what they really were, criminals. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The prosecutor demanded the highest penalties for all. Colonel Kozlov spoke for the prosecution. These people betrayed trust, used power for crimes. If we don't punish them, we'll say such is permissible. The judges went to deliberate. 3 agonizing hours of waiting, Olga held Dasha's hand and prayed for justice. When the judges returned, the chief judge stood. In the name of the law, the court finds all 8 guilty. Pavel Lebedev, Vladimir Smirnov, Stepan Popov to the supreme measure of punishment by firing squad, and the other 5 to 25 years deprivation of liberty in a strict regime colony without right of pardon. Roar, cries, sobs. Relatives of the victims embraced, sobbing with relief. Olga hugged Dasha, and both sisters cried from pain, from joy, from realizing the nightmare was over. The defendants were led away. Lebedev walked with head down, Smirnov with head high, but eyes empty. Popov turned back at the end. Hatred was in his gaze, but it no longer mattered. The sentence was passed. Justice triumphed. 3 weeks later came word. Alexei was caught at the border. He tried to flee with fake documents, resisted arrest, was wounded. He was brought to the regional center. Olga came to his trial, looked at the man with whom she'd lived 8 years, and didn't recognize him. Alexei had aged, grown gaunt, broken. When the judge offered the last word, Alexei stood and looked at Olga. I don't ask forgiveness. I did what I wanted, used opportunities. Olga stood and replied, you chose to become a monster. You chose to kill. Now you'll pay for it. Alexei was sentenced to firing squad. 2 months later, the sentence was carried out. Olga didn't go to watch. She just received the notice and felt relief. Finally, it was all over. On the appointed day, the 3 main criminals, Lebedev, Smirnov, and Popov, were led into the prison yard. Gray morning, drizzling rain. 3 men who for years considered themselves masters of life now stood against the wall with blindfolds. Command volley. 3 bodies crumpled to the ground. The other 5 were sent to a colony in the far north. 25 years behind bars in the cold. Among real criminals, who don't like those who abused women. Their lives there turned into hell, the very hell they created for their victims. The 3 rescued women slowly returned to life. Natalia got married, had a child. The other 2 underwent treatment, but were also recovering. Dasha lived with Olga, went to the doctor, learned to smile again. In the city, leadership changed. Checks were conducted, dozens of cases reviewed, several more accomplices criminals found. They too were tried and imprisoned. Olga stayed in the regional center, found work, rented an apartment. Life went on, calm, ordinary, without nightmares. Sometimes she remembered those 17 women they didn't save, remembered Tamara and Irina, but also remembered the 3 saved. Remembered how the bodies of the 3 ringleaders fell to the ground after the volley, how the others were taken behind bars for the rest of their lives. Justice triumphed, long, agonizing, but inevitable. The criminals paid in full, some with life, some with freedom, all in full. And Olga and Dasha got what they'd sought for 7 years each other, and the chance to start life anew, knowing the nightmare was behind them, the monsters defeated, evil punished,